It's November 1875, and the most powerful banker in the world is eating grapes. Lionel de Rothschild sits in his private office in London, spitting seeds onto a silver plate. Across from him stands a trembling messenger from the Prime Minister. The messenger asks for £4 million. He needs it in 48 hours. No contracts. No collateral. Just a promise. Rothschild doesn't even look up. He eats another grape. Then he says 3 words that will reshape the Middle East for the next century. You shall have it. We think the Suez Canal was bought with strategy and diplomacy. We think Britain won Egypt through military genius. We're wrong. Britain bought Egypt with a loan, and that loan turned into change. This is the story of how debt conquered a nation faster than any army ever could. This is the story of financial imperialism at its purest. And it all started with a desperate man, an empty treasury, and a plate of grapes. Let's rewind to 1869. The Suez Canal has just opened. It's a miracle of engineering that slices through 100 miles of Egyptian sand. It connects the Mediterranean to the Red Sea. It cuts the journey from London to India in half. Before the canal, British merchant ships had to sail around the entire African continent. The voyage took months. Ships were lost to storms off the Cape of Good Hope. Crews died of scurvy and disease. But now a ship can glide from the Mediterranean straight into the Red Sea in less than a day. For the British Empire, this canal is not just convenient, it is existential. India is the crown jewel of the empire. India provides cotton, tea, spices, opium, and tax revenue. Without India, Britain is just a cold island in the North Atlantic. The canal is the artery that keeps the imperial heart pumping. But here's the problem. Britain doesn't own the canal. In fact, Britain hated the canal when it was first proposed. British engineers called the project impossible. They said the desert sand would collapse into the trench. They said the tides would flood the excavation. British politicians called it a French conspiracy to dominate the East, and they were partly right. The canal was built by a Frenchman named Ferdinand de Lesseps. He was a charming diplomat who convinced the Egyptian ruler to grant him a concession. He sold shares to French investors. He hired French engineers. When the canal opened, it was draped in French flags. The ownership structure was simple. French private investors owned 52%. The Khedive of Egypt owned 44%. The remaining shares were scattered among small investors. Britain owned nothing. For 6 years the British watched as French ships and French capital dominated the most strategic waterway on Earth. The British Empire was at the mercy of a French company. Then in November 1875, everything changed. The man who owned those Egyptian shares was Ismail Pasha. He was the Khedive, which is the Turkish title for the Viceroy of Egypt. Ismail was a man of staggering ambition and catastrophic judgment. When he came to power, he looked at Cairo and saw backwater. He wanted to turn it into Paris. He built opera houses. He paved roads. He installed gas lamps. He laid thousands of miles of railway track and telegraph wire. He hired Italian architects to design grand boulevards. He threw parties that made European royalty jealous. When the Suez Canal opened, he invited Empress Eugenie of France to be his guest of honor. He built a road from the pyramids to his palace just so her carriage wouldn't get dusty. He commissioned Giuseppe Verdi to write an opera. Aida premiered in Cairo with champagne flowing and diamonds scattered like confetti. But Ismail had one fatal flaw. He was spending money he didn't have. He borrowed from European banks at interest rates that would make a loan shark blush. In the 1860s, during the American Civil War, Egyptian cotton prices soared. The American South was blockaded. European textile mills were desperate for cotton. Egypt filled the gap. Ismail thought the boom would last forever. He borrowed against future cotton revenues. He signed loans at 10% interest, then 12, then 15. The bankers in London and Paris knew he was doomed, but they kept lending because the interest was irresistible. When the American Civil War ended, cotton prices crashed. The revenues vanished overnight, but the debt did not. Ismail kept borrowing to pay the interest on the old loans. He was running a Ponzi scheme with the country. By 1875, Egypt's debt had ballooned to nearly 100 million pounds. That's the equivalent of billions today. The interest payments alone consumed 70% of Egypt's annual revenue. The treasury was hemorrhaging. Soldiers went unpaid. Teachers went unpaid. Tax collectors were squeezing the peasants until they had nothing left to give. Ismail was facing a debt payment in December. He needed 4 million pounds immediately. The coffers were empty. He had one asset left, his shares in the Suez Canal Company. It was the family silver. It was the last thing he wanted to sell. But he had no choice. He quietly sent word to the French government. He said he was willing to sell his 44% stake for 4 million pounds. The French were ecstatic. If they bought those shares, they would control almost the entire canal. The Mediterranean would become a French lake, but there was a leak. A British journalist named Frederick Greenwood heard the rumor at a dinner party. He rushed to the Foreign Office. He told Lord Derby, the Foreign Secretary. Derby told Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli. And that's when the telegram landed on Disraeli's desk. Benjamin Disraeli was 70 years old. He was a novelist turned politician. He was flamboyant, theatrical, and utterly convinced of Britain's imperial destiny. He had fought his way to the top of a society that despised him for being Jewish. He had converted to Christianity as a child. But the stain of outsider never washed off. He compensated by being more patriotic, more imperial, more British than anyone else. When he read the telegram from Cairo, he saw the opportunity of a lifetime. If he could buy those shares, he would secure the route to India forever. He would turn a French project into a British asset. He would humiliate France. He would cement his legacy as the savior of the empire. But there was a monstrous problem. He needed 4 million pounds in 48 hours, and the British Parliament was in recess. Under British law, the government could not spend a single penny without parliamentary approval. Disraeli could not write a check from the Treasury. If he waited for Parliament to reconvene in January, the Khedive would be bankrupt. Or worse, the French would have already closed the deal. The French government didn't need parliamentary approval for every transaction. They had the cash ready. They were drafting contracts. Disraeli was trapped. He sat at his desk and stared at the fire. He was exhausted. His rival, William Gladstone, would have been horrified by the idea of spending 4 million pounds on a secret deal. Gladstone believed in peace, retrenchment, and fiscal responsibility. Disraeli believed in action and glory. He knew that if he let this moment pass, it would never come again. He called his private secretary, Montague Corey, into the room. Corey was young and loyal. He worshipped the old man. Disraeli looked at him, and asked a question that sounded insane. "Where can we find £4 million by Tuesday?" Corey didn't laugh. He knew the Prime Minister was serious. They went through the options. The Bank of England was the obvious choice. But the governor of the bank was a cautious bureaucrat. He would demand paperwork. He would demand a vote. He would never agree to lend such a massive sum for a secret political gamble. There was no time for committees. Disraeli needed a private source. He needed someone with enough liquidity to move millions in gold at a moment's notice. He needed someone who trusted him personally. He needed someone who understood that this was not just business. It was geopolitics. There was only one name that fit: the Rothschilds. The House of Rothschild was the most powerful financial dynasty on earth. They had branches in London, Paris, Vienna, Frankfurt, and Naples. They had financed wars and railroads. They had bailed out kings. The head of the London branch was Lionel de Rothschild. He was a personal friend of Disraeli. They shared a bond. Both were Jewish outsiders who had clawed their way to the pinnacle of power. Disraeli turned to Corey and gave him a verbal order. "Go to the city. Find Lionel de Rothschild. Ask him for £4 million. Corey asked what he should offer as collateral. Collateral is the security you give a lender to guarantee repayment. Usually you offer land or gold or bonds. Disraeli had none of those things. He didn't even have the legal authority to request the loan. He looked at Corey and said 5 words. "The British government is security." It was a bluff, a magnificent, audacious bluff. Disraeli was betting his entire career on a handshake. If Parliament returned and refused to ratify the deal, Disraeli would be ruined. He would be impeached. He might go to prison. The Rothschilds would lose their money. The scandal would bring down the government. But Disraeli was a gambler. He understood drama. He knew that history is not made by committees. It is made by individuals willing to risk everything on a single roll of the dice. Montague Corey put on his coat and walked out into the fog. London was covered in a thick yellow blanket. The gas lamps flickered in the damp air. Corey hailed a carriage and told the driver to go to New Court. That was the address of N.M. Rothschild and Sons. The streets were quiet. Corey's heart was pounding. He knew that the fate of the Middle East was riding with him in that carriage. Meanwhile, in Cairo, the Khedive was pacing in his palace. The French agents were pressing him to sign. They had the contract on the table. They told him the British were too slow. They told him Parliament would never agree. Ismail stalled. He was waiting for a signal from London. He preferred the British to the French, but he was a desperate man. If the British didn't come through by tomorrow, he would sign with France. The clock was ticking. Corey arrived at New Court. It was not a bank in the modern sense. It was a private mansion of finance. He was ushered into Lionel de Rothschild's private office. The legend of this meeting has been told in many versions, but the core remains one of the most cinematic moments in financial history. Rothschild was eating muscatel grapes. He was a man of immense composure. He did not look up when Corey entered. He continued to eat his grapes, spitting the skins and seeds onto a silver plate. Corey stood there, his heart hammering. He delivered the message. Mr. Disraeli needs £4 million. He needs it tomorrow. Rothschild paused. He picked another grape. He asked one question. "What is your security?" Corey replied exactly as instructed, the British government. Rothschild paused again. He ate the grape. Then he said simply, "You shall have it." Just like that, the deal was done. There were no lawyers. There were no 20-page contracts. There was no board meeting. It was a gentleman's agreement between the prime minister of the world's greatest empire and the head of the world's greatest bank. Rothschild agreed to advance the money immediately. He would charge a commission and interest, of course. He was a banker, not a charity, but the speed was unprecedented. The Rothschilds began mobilizing their network. They gathered gold and credit from across Europe. They prepared the transfer to Cairo. Back at Downing Street, Disraeli was waiting. When Corey returned with the news, Disraeli was ecstatic. He sat down and wrote a letter to Queen Victoria. The letter is famous for its triumphant tone. He wrote, "It is settled. You have it, madam. The French have been outmaneuvered. We have bought the Khedive shares. You now possess the key to India." He was jubilant. He felt he had secured the safety of the empire for 100 years. The next day, the money was transferred. In Cairo, the Khedive received the funds. He was relieved. He paid his immediate debts. He sent the French agents away empty-handed. The British consul general in Cairo marched into the palace and took possession of the physical share certificates. They were packed into iron boxes and shipped to England on a warship. When the news broke in London, the public went wild. The newspapers hailed Disraeli as a genius. They loved the boldness. Even Gladstone, Disraeli's bitter rival, had to admit the public was on Disraeli's side. Parliament returned in January and voted to ratify the purchase. The Rothschilds were repaid with interest. Britain now owned 44% of the Suez Canal, but the story does not end with the purchase. The purchase was just the beginning of the tragedy. The £4 million that Disraeli sent to Cairo was a fortune. But for Khedive Ismail, it was a drop in the ocean. His debts were so massive that the $4 million vanished almost instantly. It went to pay interest on other loans. Within months, Ismail was broke again, but this time things were different. Before the sale, Britain was just an observer in Egypt. Now Britain was a major shareholder. Britain owned almost half the canal. This meant Britain had a direct financial stake in the internal affairs of Egypt. When Ismail announced he could not pay his debts in 1876, the British government could no longer ignore it. They couldn't say this was a private matter between the Khedive and his creditors. Now it was a matter of national interest. The British and French governments sent a commission to Cairo. This was called the Cave Mission. They opened the books and were horrified. The corruption and waste were staggering. The European powers decided Ismail could not be trusted. They set up a system called dual control. This was a humiliating arrangement for a sovereign nation. An English official was placed in charge of Egypt's revenue. A French official was placed in charge of Egypt's expenditure. They effectively took over the Egyptian government. They slashed spending. They raised taxes on the peasants. They cut the pay of the army. They did everything a ruthless bankruptcy lawyer would do. But they did it to an entire country. The Egyptian people were furious. They saw their ruler as a puppet of the Christians. They saw their taxes going to pay Jewish and Christian bankers in London and Paris, while their children went hungry. A nationalist movement began to rise. It was led by an army officer named Colonel Ahmed Arabi. He rallied the army and the people with a simple slogan, "Egypt for the Egyptians." He wanted to kick out the foreign advisors. He wanted to end dual control. He wanted to depose the Khedive and establish a parliament. The British government watched with alarm. They didn't care about Egyptian democracy. They cared about the Suez Canal. They were terrified that a nationalist government would seize the canal or refuse to pay the debts. The bondholders in the City of London were pressuring the government to intervene. They whispered that Arabi was a dangerous radical. They said the canal was in danger. In 1882, the tension exploded. Riots broke out in Alexandria. Europeans were killed. The British government, now led by Gladstone, felt compelled to act. Gladstone had ironically opposed Disraeli's imperialism. But now he was in power, and power changes perspective. The British sent the Royal Navy to Alexandria. They bombarded the city. They destroyed the fortifications. They set the city on fire. Then they landed troops. They marched toward Cairo. At the Battle of Tel el-Kebir, the British army crushed Arabi's nationalist forces. The British cavalry rode into Cairo and took control of the citadel. Khedive Ismail was deposed and replaced by his son Tewfik, a compliant puppet. British generals claimed they came only to restore order, promising a temporary stay. They never left. That temporary occupation lasted 72 years. A £4 million loan became a military conquest, transforming Britain from a trading empire into a ruling one. That single loan pulled Britain step by step into the desert. Buy the shares, protect the shares, protect the shares, control Egypt's government, control the government, occupy the country, protect the occupation, seize Sudan and the Nile's headwaters. It was mission creep on a continental scale. Disraeli never lived to see it. He died believing he had made a clever financial move, unaware he had triggered a chain reaction that would shape the modern Middle East. The Suez Canal became Britain's obsession. It dictated strategy in 2 world wars, justified the betrayal of Arab allies, and shaped borders drawn to protect one waterway at all costs. The Rothschilds were repaid swiftly, £4 million plus interest, proving once again that bankers outlived empires. Egypt, however, paid for generations. Only in 1956 did Egypt reclaim the canal, when Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized it. Britain and France invaded and were forced to retreat, humiliated, as the United States and Soviet Union condemned them. It was the moment the empire's power finally broke. All of it traced back to one meeting in 1875. No invasion. No battle. Just a checkbook. The lesson is brutal and enduring. Debt is a weapon. Lose solvency and sovereignty follows. Empires don't lend to help. They lend to own.